Hello! Well, it's finally time for this. And when I started the county class, I honestly didn't really think about the end of the county class. The last video about them, I honestly didn't think about it at all, really. It seems such a long way away, and such a different time scale, that it wasn't really something for me to consider. But now I'm here, and I have some pre-made chocolate milkshake because honestly I didn't feel like making my own. And I felt this was deserved something slightly different than Iron Brew, because the county class cruisers are special. They really are. They're different. They're always going to be different because they were designed in the 1920s, rebuilt in the 1930s, limited by treaties conceived in those periods, but based on knowledge experienced in World War One, and then fought in World War Two. A completely different conflict in terms of its application of naval and maritime power. And they suffer for that. You know, one of the most interesting responses I've gotten in this video is in terms of comment response was a response to some remarks I made about the Alaska class from Steve Windish, which goes full on various things. And I'm not going to get into them, because when I was talking about the people who make jokes about the Alaska class, I wasn't talking about British people. Although there are some British academics who probably do, I was talking about various academics from lots of countries, including America. Because the trouble is, by the time the Alaskas come into service, they might be the rootin' tootin' best cruiser you can build, but the things they were conceived to fight don't exist, and the enemies they were conceived to wage war against are not really in the position to fight them. And that's why they're made jokes of, because they're sort of the ultimate power of a cruiser symbol. And yeah, there's no one for them to fight. And it's kind of the reverse of what you're dealing with in the counties, because if the counties had been called upon to take part in a war in the 1920s, they would have been the dominators. Think about it in the 1920s. Think about, seriously, what their competition would have been in the 1920s. Nothing. And the problem for the Royal Navy, and I'd say the problem which originally leads to the counties existing in the first place, is because the Royal Navy hasn't kept up a consistent cruisers program pre-World War One, and especially not during World War One, mostly thanks to that wonderful visionary, but also really, really all-round annoying gentleman on occasion, Jackie Fisher. What am I saying? I'm saying this. When you get to county class cruisers, when you look at them, and I'll be discussing this as we go through, you are seeing a large light cruiser. That is what the Royal Navy was building. The Royal Navy should have been building cruisers, larger cruisers, in the 1910s. Said they're building battle cruisers, which is fine, but a battle cruiser becomes a capital unit, and also a battle cruiser is a massive investment. And you go, well, they're building the town class light cruisers. Yes, they are. So they're building cruisers right about the smallest level they're going to build, one up from scout cruisers in many ways, but light cruisers. And then they're building battle cruisers up at the top. And they're relying on the legacy ships filling in the bit in the middle. And God bless the armoured cruisers, they do their best, but they don't. When you consider the pace of technological development and change and evolution going on at the time, they never had a chance of doing that. And in many ways, as I've said before, Alaska is the true inheritor of the armoured cruiser. It's a true heavy cruiser. It's what a heavy cruiser of the 1940s should have looked like. And there's the really big joke on everyone. Okay? Everyone should have had cruisers like the Alaska class, because that's what a heavy cruiser, if you adjust for inflation and what the expansion and the qualitative build and levels should have done without the treaties, without some of the silly decisions made, that's what you should have been dealing with. And ultimately, when the Royal Navy does start building large, light cruisers, courageous, glorious, furious, well, they're not exact. They are actually battle cruisers, aren't they? It should actually be called probably light battle cruisers, rather than large light cruisers. Well, that's a misnomer. You're going to have a large ship that's also a light ship. It's going to be a cruiser. One of these things is not like the other. So, this is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with, honestly, a world which is not thinking right. And again, it comes back to the fact that World War I is dominated by the North Sea. We call World War I a world war because there are events around the world and it does involve partners around the world. But there aren't massive battles up and down the Mediterranean. They're mostly the Aegean and a bit in the Eastern, when occasionally the Ottomans venture out of the Dardanelles. There's battles in the Black Sea, but not much. There's battles in the Baltic, not much. There's battles in the North Sea, but not that many really, when we consider how close and how approximate the forces are, how massive each side is. And it gives a very false idea of what a cruiser's job is going to be in case of war. Because if you think about it, Napoleonic Wars, frigates were sailing all around the frickin' world. They were everywhere. They were cruising hither and thither and yonder. They were a permanent shortage in terms of numbers. You never had enough cruisers because you had to be so many other places. I mean, it's the same at the beginning of World War I, but very quickly, Battle of the Falkland Islands, there's no more German forces out there, there's no more Asiatic squadron causing any trouble. Okay? Well, where do you need ships? Patrolling the North Sea. Where do you need ships? Patrolling the North Sea. That's what they're doing. So you don't have really the independent cruising that you would have needed the larger cruisers for. And the armoured cruisers then become what? Some sort of second-class battleship? They're pre-dreadnought in shape and scope and size, really. So they're not going to fill that role. What's the cruiser's duty in the battle fleet? Stop enemy cruisers getting to your battleships and launching torpedoes. Stop enemy destroyers getting to your battleships and launching torpedoes. What do you need for that role? Well, we need a cruiser which is fast and has lots of rapid-firing guns. Light cruiser it is. What do you need for a cruiser to deal with surface raiders? That's where the heavy cruiser is supposed to come in. And here, finally, is the county class comparison. And I know some of you don't like it on orange, but orange is kind of this channel's colour. And I say that today while drinking chocolate milk. If we consider the classes and their average displacement, the Kent class, 10,400 tons average, standard. The London's, 9,840 tons average, standard. Norfolk's, 10,400 tons average, standard. And this all seems to be before they've added the extra, honestly, we didn't pre-order and have it cut and sitting there ready to go, 4-inch armour plate, ready to go. York's, 8,250 tons standard, or 8,390 tons standard. I'm going to be talking a lot in the upcoming months about the American Cruiser program. I'm going to talk something similar about the British Cruiser program, and probably about a few other nations' cruiser programs over time. You have an artificial cap put on your cruiser dimensions by treaty. This artificial cap, it could work, it might not. It really doesn't work for anyone. Because the moment you include it as heavy and light cruisers into this idea with the London treaties, and you transition between the two, and you put tonnage limitations on the top of them, so you can't just build up in numbers. You have vamoosed yourself. I mean, literally, the big problem for the Royal Navy lies that when there's no number limitations, they do not take advantage of it to build as many of the Norfolk class as they can. You know, they should have just been churning those out. We're limited to 10,000 tons, except 10,400. Woohoo! Churn them out. There's other problems. Let's be honest. If you're going there and saying, right then, we are limited to 10,000 tons, right then, what is the most efficient ship hull shape we can build and design? Do we know one of those? Well, yes, we do, because we've been designing it. We started off with developing it based on the fact that we were going to have infrastructure limitations, because we didn't think we were going to get the new infrastructure upgrades in 1922, because we didn't think the government gives money, so we have till 1928, we have to use the same infrastructure. We last upgraded in 1910, so we have to get the most out of the infrastructure possible. And limitations, we don't want to. Something the size of Hood is not going to be able to fit in enough infrastructure, enough dry dock, so we have come with the G3 and, you know, design, blah, blah, blah. Then we have a tonnage limitation. We take the very efficient design, we adjust it to the tonnage limitation, we come up with a Nelson Romney. Okay. We have even tighter limitations on our cruisers, on our county class. All right. What shall we use? What shall we do? We're going to keep to a very conventional design. Oh. We are? Yes, and we're going to keep twin turrets. Oh. We are? 2 fore, 2 aft. Yes, we are. Okay. And, yeah, they get round it because, basically, they put no armor on them, which is kind of like a light cruiser, and then they have the armor ready to insert it later, which they probably shouldn't have, but suggest at least one member of the DNC, or probably a few others in the DNC, were sitting there thinking, these will pass the test. Again, we like to think such thinking as what happened with Volkswagen and their pollution-busting things is new thinking. It's a new age. It wouldn't have done this in the 1920s and 30s. Royal Navy did this. And then in comparison, you have their contemporaries, the Miyako class, built 1924 to 1929. I've been over them before. Standard load, 11,633 tons. Busted the treaty by 1,200 tons. Well, no. More than 1,200 tons more than the county class, and 1,633 tons more than the treaty limits, supposedly. 35.5 knots top speed. 10 7.9-inch guns in 5 twin mounts. So it has a 2-gun advantage. 3 turrets forward. It's an interesting design ship, but it's basically got almost a Nelson arrangement forward. Shows someone sort of thinking about the efficient ship idea, although in the nicest way, in full Japanese style, to make it all work, you've had to go well over the tonnage limitations. And for the Trento class, well, full load 13,000 tons. Standard load is something which is of an interesting discussion. And I will say this, an interesting discussion point, because there's what they start out with, and there's what they end up with, and there's what they probably were, and there's various reports, but let's say they were nominally within the 10,000 ton limit. In simple words, not a single one of the cruisers designed in this period that are fitting the new heaviest of the cruiser role you can give them, because the largest guns you can put on a non-cavalry ship is 8-inch guns. The largest weight they can be is 10,000 tons. No one is hitting this. Not a silly sausage. Not a single silly sausage is hitting this target. And yes, that is one of my grandfather's phrases, and that is designed to wind up people, but it works well. Not a single one is hitting that target. It was designed around the Hawkins class, who are probably some of the most ill-designed ships the Royal Navy's ever put together. And I say this with a lot of love for the Hawkins class, because that love comes out of almost feeling like this poor orphan child. The way they are developed and treated. They're coming after the previous large light cruisers, which were courageous, glorious, and furious. And so going, well, you're going to 15-inch guns? No, 7.5-inch. In turrets? No. The design of the Hawkins is so openly and obviously compromised beyond belief that using it as the template for the cruiser system is an absurd an absurd point of positioning beyond belief. It's fair. I'll discuss why in the cruiser video. But it's absurd. And this is what we're looking at when these cruisers. So when someone turns around to me and goes, well, this cruiser has these problems, the response I normally give is, so every cruiser has problems. Every ship, you cannot design a perfect ship for a roles. Now, we consider the Arafusa class. Well, you've got ARA La Argentina out there, which is basically an Arafusa with triple turrets. An Arafusa with the firepower of a Crown Colony class. A later model Crown Colony class. Ooh. That's a sexy beast. But again, the Royal Navy's got the Arafusas, they're moving on, they build them the Town class, they've got the Town class, they're bigger, they're fine, they're doing what the Royal Navy wants. But the Arafusa class are possibly my favourite class of cruisers in World War II. And I can already tell you there is something which is a better version of an Arafusa. Is it a perfectly better version of Arafusa? No. It still has compromises. And the compromises are forced by this obsession with treaty. And this impacts every single level of design. In every navy. Even if you're not taking notice of them, and I would argue the Japanese are not, or are sort of avoiding them, skipping round them, you are still limited by them, because you cannot go completely out of the range of what could, in theory, potentially, if you were using paper-thin aluminium that you build on 10,000 tons. And this leads us to the Battle of River Plain. The interwar years, the County class are these big ships. They are beautiful present ships. They are really big statements when they show up, and they do look really good. And there is an advantage to having the twin turret form, in that they do look like they could potentially be a battleship from a distance. But it's not really great. But then we have this. This is the Grass Bay. This is also another imperfect creature. Another one. Why am I saying imperfect? It's not a pocket battleship. It's a heavy cruiser. It's nowhere near as good a heavy cruiser as the Alaskas were. But in a world where war doesn't come for, I don't know, till 1942, 43, and the Alaskas get built, voila! They're heavy cruisers. This is what the Germans have, and this is what the Americans have, and the British would have probably built a response, and the Japanese, who knows, probably wouldn't have been able to build a response, especially if they'd been building Yamato's successors. They wouldn't have built anything else other than Yamato's successors. But the point is, they would have had justification. And that could have been a really interesting fight, an Alaska versus one of these. My money's on the Alaska. Every day of the week and 5 times on Sunday. But, you know, this is what a heavy cruiser is sort of looking at bridging like. And it's the limitation. When you're sticking a rule on battleship guns and capital ship guns, that capital ships can any non-capital ship can only have its guns as high as 8 inches. Okay, capital ships are limited to 16-inch. Now, I do realise there is a valiant effort by Chatfield, Vickers, and the British establishment to get the 14-inch to be the new coming of the new second coming gun, and everyone to love it. But let's be honest, what happens the moment you set ceilings is everyone's going to be aiming for that ceiling. And let's also be honest, if you hadn't had the treaty system, then the battleships would have probably gone up to about 18-inch. Probably some would have built a 20-inch gun, probably would be in the Japanese. But you'd have ended up with the battleships on 18-inch, battlecruisers 16 to 18-inch, depending on the nation. That's probably where it would sort of reach its top. And you would have had the cruisers end up on roughly 11, 12-inch guns. Because that would have fitted. And you would probably had a light cruiser on 6-inch guns. Maybe 8-inch. Again, because that's where it would have fitted. And Battle of River Plate. This rather large cruiser finds itself facing, under Henry Harwood, Commodore, the Royal Navy, 2 Royal Navy ships and a New Zealand ship. He finds himself facing HMS Ajax, HMS Achilles, which at that point was HMNZ as Achilles, well, soon to be NZS Achilles, and HMS Exeter. HMS Exeter is, of course, a cut price county. We're going to pay just as much and get a quarter less good ship. All in the idea it would save tonnage. Which it would have in theory if you'd been able to build enough. But they didn't get to build enough. And I think, again, there is a reason why the British are so happy to exchange heavy cruiser tonnage for light cruiser tonnage. Because in the world which is pre-radar, even when you're developing radar, but the world which is pre-radar, especially in the 1930, when you're putting 1930 naval treaties together, let's look at it this way. You got 2 ships which are going to have roughly the same amount of armor. One of them is going to have 8 to 10 guns of a higher caliber, big 8-inch guns, but they're going to be slower firing, and they're going to have roughly the same actual practical engagement range as another ship which has 6-inch guns but can carry 12 to 15 of those. Even when we're talking about this ship, which is the pocket battleship Deutschen-class heavy cruiser, and we all know what I feel about pocket battleships, people try and put all the damage down to the 8-inch guns of HMS Exeter, and perhaps she did get many, many silver bullets. But there are large numbers of amount of areas of that ship which are not that heavily armoured. They can't be to save weight and to make it able to do what it has to do. And those areas were plastered in 6-inch fire from 2 Leander class light cruisers armed with 8 6-inch guns. If that thing had come across a full fat county and a town class, it would have been in a nightmare. It'd be sitting there going, what happened to me? Because the sheer volume of shells raining down on it. And the point I have to make with this, again, and this is the point with the 6-inch shell, it's the N law. It's the more shells you're firing, the more likely you are to get a hit and more accurate you're likely to be because you're blastering more in the area. And all these things build up. It's the factors behind behind the treaties. It's a factor behind fleet designs for World War I and all those things. All these things they go back to the equations, and it's the same with the 6-inch shells because when you're talking about penetration defense, okay, let's say you're a really strong. It's got a really strong hull, designed to withstand 8-inch gunfire. Gets hit by the first 6-inch shell, doesn't penetrate. Of course, it's not going to, but it'll go off outside. Heat explosion will do some damage. Okay. Now, if it was an 8-inch shell, boom, it goes off outside. Heat explosion does some damage. Second 8-inch shell will enter. It will get through. If it hits roughly the same area, it will probably smash through and do damage. The 6-inch shell, the second one might get through. The third one hitting will get through. And if you've got a rate of fire where you're able to fire 6 shells per gun for every 4 shells per gun you fire, the 8-inch fires, and you've got 8 8-inch versus 12 6-inch, well, that means you're firing 72 rounds for the equivalent of 32. The odds of you getting that second, third hit go up. They really do. And that's the real problem for the counties. And then we have the Fall of Crete and poor HMS York, who actually does a pretty good job, but I always think looks like she's someone was designing a G3 and they just said, you know what, we can't put the turret between the superstructure and the funnel, it'll just look weird. So what we'll do is we'll put the turret back on the back. I've had actually more respect if they had gone full G3 with this design. But then they'd have had to go for triple 8-inch turrets. And I'd have respected that. I wouldn't have agreed with the placing of the turret, but I could have respected it. As it is, it looks like a cut price county. And the thing is, these cruisers are important to the Mediterranean. They're important in every area of conflict, but in the Mediterranean they're more important than perhaps any other. Because the basis of the Italian strength is their 8-inch cruisers, is their heavy cruiser force. That is the Italian measure of strength, their elan, their fighting raison d'etre. And you need to be able to match up to them. And you need to be able to look like you match up to them. And this ship doesn't look like it can match up to them. It does. I know it fights very hard. But the trouble is, a cruiser's role is about more than just operating in war. It's about its peacetime presence mission as well. Saying that, though, she's still a loss. Every 8-inch cruiser lost is a loss. And it's an important loss. It's something which matters. Because the British are building more 6-inch cruisers. So you don't want to lose one, but you might be able to replace it. The British are building more destroyers. They lose all sorts of capital ships. They only build one. They only basically Well, the King George V's come into service, so you can say they replace some of the losses, and Vanguard comes into service. So yeah, they replace the losses that way, you can sort of say. But they don't build heavy cruisers. They don't build their equivalent to an Alaska class. And arguably, they needed it long before the Alaska's good, but it's because if you haven't been building ships in that sort of sphere for that while, it's difficult to design what you need. That's one of the problems that I'm going to get into in the American design process, is that they have trouble with their cruisers because they don't have a cruiser force, and they suddenly need to design one. And that causes them to go, well, what do we need to put in here? And didn't you lose 2 more cruisers in the Easter Sunday raid? Lost in the Indian Ocean. And those were ships which should not have been lost. Critical ships, useful ships, vital ships. And they were lost. It's all part of the Indian Ocean raid, of course, and it's part of what happens, but this is Dorsetshire and Cornwall. Reliving, in many ways, what Prince of Wales and Repulse went through. And again, their ships caught out on their own. Does this mean ships shouldn't operate on their own? No. Sometimes they're going to need to. But they weren't prepared for this kind of operation and this kind of war. Because when they were designed and when they were being first put together, this wasn't on anyone's radar as a possibility. Now, I know there are going to be some people going to come back with the air power theorists. And there are some very interesting air power theorists. Trust me, I read them during my PhD thesis. I had to put them together and look at them. And they were real prophets, in some respects. What their prophets of was of what became nuclear war. Because it would be bombers loaded with hundreds of tons each of biological weapons and get nerve gas and those things raining down on cities. They conceived of there being a nuclear weapon that could wipe out a city from one bomb. Well, they'd have been very much for it. They took That's something which comes later, which gets developed in time. And really, this is another reason why there's the problem with the British cruiser construction program, and why the counties are out of time. If we consider the US Navy converts some of their cruiser production into carriers, the Royal Navy doesn't have the ongoing cruiser production program that it can convert anything into a carrier. It doesn't have enough cruisers coming along. And that's again because of the situation the Royal Navy found itself in as a result of the treaties. The Royal Navy had always had a policy, and the British government always had a policy, of keeping up a certain momentum in construction in peacetime, occasionally adapting that momentum when needed to wave off financial disasters and issues with the shipyards, but also being able to surge it up in wartime. The treaties had reduced the level of construction dramatically. So that meant you didn't have the cruisers on the construction. And also meant you didn't have the development and evolutionary development the RN relied upon for its cruiser force. The RN was not in the style of making big leaps. They never seem to adapt well when they have to make a big leap in terms of technology. They like to make evolutionary leaps. You can almost say that the reason that after Dreadnought's creation, the Royal Navy goes, we need to take a breath, is because they are shocked by their own leap. And you can also say they didn't leap far enough, because, again, if you had leaped further, and I mean this sincerely, if you had leaped further, you could have done a lot more. The real problem for the British when it comes to Dreadnought is that they go for 12-inch guns and they basically go with the same guns that they've got off their pre-dreads. Twin turrets, dun dun dun. There are 14-inch guns available. There are even bigger guns available. There are turbo turrets available, roughly at that sort of period, which they really could have pushed for. They could have gone with super firing, but Jackie Fisher himself admitted he didn't realise you could do super firing, i.e. one turret over the other. They could have pushed the speed higher than 21 knots. All these things could have been done, probably delivered in a reasonable time, maybe slightly later, but not much later, and would have given the Royal Navy a big step up. Such a big step that it would have taken a lot longer for the other nations to catch up with it. Because you can't turn around and say, well, we're going to put our battleships in the wall of 11-inch guns when your enemy's fielding 14-inch guns. You can't. You're going to have to develop a new gun. You're going to have to upgrade your firepower. And it's the same when you go through the various options. The Battle of Sava, and of course, involved two full fat counties, Australia and Canberra, and the Chicago from the US Navy was in the Southern Force with them. And they also had 3 New Orleans class heavy cruisers, Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy, also along in the Allied forces involved in Savo Island. The Americans lost 3 heavy cruisers in that battle. 3. And the counties came through, but that's as much due to luck than anything else, and training than their design. And the fact is, if you look at all those class of ships, none of them is what their nations were capable of building. To be honest, the counties, they have this wonderful thing. They're 8-inch guns can fire up to 70 degrees. Elevate to 70 degrees and still fire their guns. So they can use for AA. It's brilliant skill. The next Mark II turret, which is supposed to be lighter but ends up heavier, and can't do that. How? How does that happen? Well, I can tell you how it happens. You've lost the skill. You've got such a low rate of production, you've lost a design skill. You aren't doing an evolutionary design program. You're doing we're designing this, and then we're designing this. We're not designing this, and then evolving that a bit, and then evolving that a bit. Again, I would say the Americans, who do far smaller batches of ships, and don't try and call them the same class, so do allow them to be quite different from each other, do it better, but theirs produces their own weirdness. The Royal Navy tries to keep them all to the county class. And the thing is, they're pretty ships, so it's hard to say this, but in many ways they are a camel. They are a horse designed by committee. They've even got the hump of the funnels in the centre. They are put together by people who are trying to fulfill all the roles they need covered under new limitations which they themselves proposed and agreed to. And when I say they themselves, I mean the British as a whole proposed the 10,000 ton limit, proposed the whole idea, because, you know, it's one of the options they put in, expecting, and I have to admit this one, I'll explain this more in a particular video about that treaty, expecting to be told that's not enough. Way to shoot yourself in the foot. And it's also one thing accepting 10,000 tons when you think you are going to be given the treaties, the treasury support, and so the financial support from your government, and have the political support necessary, firepower, to build as many ships as you want because you're not limited in overall tonnage. So yeah, this isn't as good a cruiser as we can build, but we can build 10 of them. And with our infrastructure, we can build 10 of them. And every time, and no matter how many they order, they never get what they ordered. They never get what they order. They never get what they need. So many compromises designed into a single hull. And yet I still like them. I just think about what they could have been. And I think about what lessons they teach us. And they do teach us lessons. The cut-price counties. Well, they teach us that even when you do cut the price, the ship can still be valuable. But that it's going to depend upon luck and good crew, and the training of the crew. And if you don't allow it to have that training, and you don't give it that time so that sort of good crew can self-replicate, and you keep up the high quality that will get the level best out of that design, then you are going to end up in a scenario where you lose your ship. Various battles of Java. The counties fought throughout World War II. Berwick is the most frustrated ship in the world. Keeps coming this close to Grass Bay. This close! And doesn't actually catch hold of her. But Grass Bay keeps dodging her because Grass Bay doesn't want to take on a full fat county. It has 6 11-inch guns versus 8 8-inch guns. It has armor. It should be happy to take on a full fat county. It isn't. It doesn't want to. When it eventually gets cornered by Exeter and the Leanders, I have a really interesting sort of perspective when it comes, whenever I sort of see that point in the video and the movie The Rattler of Blake, where they say, you know, I think there are a cruiser and 2 destroyers. I thought they were a cruiser and 2 destroyers because that's how they're acting. And when I found out that was a real quote and a real thing said, it made me think through, what do they think they were? Well, they must have thought the cruiser was an Arethusa class, because that's the only one which would fit that shape at that time of Exeter. And the destroyers must have been thought to be Travel class. And honestly, I'm not sure whether Grass Bay would have done that well versus 2 Travel class destroyers and an Arethusa class light cruiser, but, you know, probably, yeah, they'd probably come out roughly the same. Do enough damage to force it to go to port. and then wait for the really big boys to arrive. And one of the really big boys that did arrive was the Full Fat County. And that was the one that was there soonest. The first reinforcement to arrive. And the one which basically meant, okay, versus a 6-gun Type B county cruiser, you did what? There's a Type A out there. And there's Renown and Ark Royal on their way. One to get you if you're still in harbour, one to make sure you don't get far if you get out of harbour. Heavy cruisers are, as I've said previously, are light cruisers. That's where they come from in sort of the cruiser pantheon, if you're growing them up. Not armour cruisers. And therefore we have to consider them as light cruisers, really, if we're being fair to them. And as large light cruisers, the County class have an incredible value. But this means that there are only a few classes of real heavy cruiser actually built for World War II. Deutschland class, probably up there. The Alaska class, definitely there. But that means they don't have a proper World War II because they don't really have any peers or any threats, especially not the Alaskas by the time they come out. And in the County class term, they're the heavy cruiser we associate with it because they have 18 guns. So that's what defines a heavy cruiser by treaty after 1930. Suddenly, the biggest gun now defines what the most powerful ship is, and you're now practically limited down to 6-inch. And you're not even limited below that once you're looking at frigates. I mean, destroyers and sloops and later on frigates. Frigates World War II. So I suppose I'm waffling a bit, but I'm trying to bring in all the various information you have to think about and all the context you have to realise before you can start doing a value of the County class. And their value, truly, their value, comes not from their guns, or their size, or their displacement, quality of their design. It comes from their presence. The County class were the ships the Royal Navy had when they went to war. They were the ships they had when they tried to bring about peace. They were the ships they could use when they needed them. And they do their job well. Are they the ships I would build for the role? No. Are they the ships the Royal Navy would have built for the role if it hadn't been for the treaties? No. Are they the ships the Royal Navy should have built for the role even with the treaties? No. But they're what they built. They're what they had. And they did their duty. They did it as well as they could. So their value was immense. And their lesson is immense. Because their lesson is the most classic example of you don't fight wars with what you want to have. You fight wars with what you do have. And you fight battles with what you have available. And if you consider the number of battles a County class were in, and the number of battles they weren't, because they just weren't available, or they were. Or in case of barracks, they'd gone off to the Falklands to get repaired for just a few days. Come on! Now's the time the grass may chose to appear? How unfair is that? She'd stalked her for months. It's just so rude. So rude. So their value? They're valuable. The lesson is tremendously. I'm going to restate it. You fight wars with what you have, not what you want. You fight battles with what you have available. There is your paper strength. There is your actual strength. And there is what you have actually within theatre in a necessary place to fight a battle. That is what you always have to remember. To win a battle, I don't have to defeat the paper strength of my opponent. I don't even have to defeat their actual strength. I just have to defeat what they can send to fight me. When you place limitations on the number of capital ships and aircraft carriers, even before aircraft carriers are recognized as being capital ships, then you automatically magnify and increase the presence, power, and prominence of their cruisers. Because they're it. The heavy cruisers become akin to battleships because you don't have anything other than heavy cruisers and battleships, and you don't have enough of either. So they become precious assets. And I would like to finish this by offering a reason for why I don't think the efficient design was chosen. And I think it's because the British were trying to ape the battleship. They were trying to up their presence and make these ships look as much like the traditional battleship form as they could in order to give them that presence. Still, an all-forward 9 8-inch gun cruiser wouldn't have been gone amiss. Maybe I'll design one in UAD and see what you guys think. Thank you very much for watching, and I finished these videos off with a question. So the question I'm going to give you is this. What would you have built? You had 10,000 tons as your limit. Standard. Please don't go full Japanese on me. But you can go British, so you can go to 10,400 tons. What would you have built in 1920s for your cruiser force? What would your cruiser force have looked like? And I want you to pick in the country, and I want you to think about it rationally from that country's perspective. What kind of cruiser force could they afford? What kind of cruiser force did they need? And what kind of infrastructure they had to support it? And please build it. I'd love to see it. I'd write it out below, send me pictures on Discord. I'd love to see what the cruiser force you build would look like. Right. Thank you very much. When this comes out, I am going to just come back, being away for the weekend, doing some teaching. So I hope you enjoy it, and hope you had fun. Thank you very much. Take care.